Hello, Booktube. My name is Mike Frost, and I'm the postmodern poetry prognosticator. A title I don't take seriously now. I've just done the newbie tag to introduce myself, and as I understand, there's a difference between the newbie tag, introducing yourself to YouTube and Booktube, and doing an introduction to your channel. So I did the newbie tag to introduce myself to you as a person, as a reader. And now I'd like to do a short video to introduce you to the channel and help you join the conversation. I hope be a part of our conversation on poetry in Booktube. So, full disclosure, I do write poetry. I write a particular form of poetry that I will talk about, but this is not an author website. I don't even want to mention my book. I won't be reviewing my book. I won't be talking about my poetry on this channel. If I do an author website, that would be something completely different. But this is a burfer channel. This is by readers for readers. I'm not trying to talk about my poetry here. I'm a reader of poetry, a lover of poetry, and I'd like to join in the conversation in Booktube on poetry and hopefully become an engaged member of the Booktube community. And my channel will focus on poetry, but I read a wide variety, so I'm open to all those sorts of things. So the first question here, when you're talking about why poetry and why now, is most people will define poetry. Start with the definition of poetry. So, how would I define poetry? Liberally, because poetry comes from the Greek word meaning to make or to build or to basically grow, to create something, and define comes from the Latin meaning to limit. So as long as you're making something, as long as you're creating something, you can't limit it. Because the minute you limit poetry and say that it must be lyrical, it must have musicality, it must have meter, then the modernists come along and change the basis of poetry from music to paintings, and suddenly you are without meter, and you have starting with free verse, which still has some meter too, but not a regular meter like a musical score, and you end up into prose poetry, which has no meter at all. So the minute you try to limit poetry to something that is lyrical, some poet will come along and expand the definition of poetry beyond that. The minute you try to say that poetry must be written in lines, that the line is the primary format of poetry, then some postmodernists will come along and create prose poetry or concrete poetry of the modernists, and there goes that definition. So the only way to define poetry is liberally. Let the poets define poetry, and I'll leave it to the poets to do that. I'll talk about their poetics. If there's a poetics of a certain school, I'd love to talk about those poetics, how they define their poetry, how they categorize their poetry. I'll talk about their poetics, but poetry I'll leave to the poets. So why now? Why this particular era? Why am I interested in postmodern poetry? And postmodern and postmodern, I don't think of as actual terms that apply to the overall thing. It's just that we are past the idea of postmodernism and into a different era, which we will have to define if you want to put a label on it. I've put many categories, and I'm going to use many categories to these things. But what I come up with, when you read anthologies like the American Hybrid, which is the most current anthology of poets, and I love to read anthologies because it brings all these poets that I'm not familiar with to me, and I can explore their poetries. They're talking about the poetry of today is a hybrid of many different schools. Like poets today aren't limiting themselves to, if I write a poem in free verse, it's all got to be free verse. They're using metered and unmetered lines in the same, and sometimes prose in the same poem. They're letting the poem dictate, the subject matter dictate what the poem shape becomes, instead of vice versa. And that's a hybrid, but the hybridness of the thing implies a combining of different elements. To understand those different elements, we'd have to understand the history, what's come before, so that's what they're combining, different elements of history. So you have to go back in the history, and one of the places to start with that, and I would be reviewing this book here, is beginning at the end, because I did begin at the end. But now we got to go back through history and talk about this. And one of the terms down here at the bottom, I don't know if you can read that, is postcolonial poetry. Postcolonial is a great term that this person uses versus postmodern, because he's talking about the poetry that came out of the colonized areas of the world. In this case, a lot of it about the Caribbean, but also about Africa, the colonized areas in the continent of Africa, South America, Central America, but a lot in the Caribbean. And he notes, as I would point out as well, that these cultures didn't go through postmodernism. Postmodernism, like modernism before it, is a term that can only be applied to the dominant culture at the time. Call it Western culture, call it European culture, call it white culture. But it is white culture that went through modernism, and especially postmodern. Postmodernism is a time of existential angst when the dominant culture, white culture, began to see its own end in history, that it would no longer be dominant. And when it realized it cannot maintain dominance over all these colonized cultures, it began to have an existential crisis, and it lost its touch with meta-narratives, the bigger narratives, that their culture was going to be the Reich that lasted forever. Well, these colonized areas never went through that. They didn't have an existential crisis over the end of white culture or white dominance. They flourished during those times. They came out and they started growing. They started recognizing all the history that had been suppressed for so long, that had been ignored for so long by the dominant culture, and started reenacting, retelling these stories, and then moving forward with these stories. But during the post-colonial period, this is when the dominant culture, the European culture, was going through its existential crisis, and these colonized, when we realized the same as the white culture, that they could not maintain dominance forever, that their Reich wasn't going to go forever. These cultures, and here I'm going to expand this a little bit. In my reviews, I'll expand this thing to the feminist movement and the LGBT community, which were, we can't say colonized, but you were certainly, it was dominated by the white, straight culture of the time. So male-dominated culture. So that, we'll call it dominance versus colonized in that case. But whilst the dominant male white culture recognized that its Reich couldn't last forever and went through an existential experience where they had incredulity toward all meta-narrative. If their meta-narrative wasn't going to work, they had incredulity toward all meta-narratives. These other cultures and the feminist movement and the LGBT community began to flourish, began to, if I may use the term, come out of the closet and start to recognize its own history, its own needs. But in that period, in that initial period, a lot of their writings, and poetry included, defined their category, their colonized area of the world, or their femininity, or their LGBT community, as an opposition to. We are this and they are that. It's a us versus them process. And that's post-colonialism. I think now that whole era, feminist writers, LGBT writers, and post-colonized areas, the writers of those areas, are beginning now to define themselves only looking at their own community. They're saying that we are this, not we are that, we were once that. Their stories are now revolving in their own community. It's not as prominent in poetry as it is in literature now, but it's beginning to make its way into poetry. And as I review these books, I hope to flourish, bring this out so that we can talk more about that, because I think an extremely important aspect of it. That is not to say that the narratives of oppression, the slave narratives, the anti-labor narratives, all these other the homophobic narratives that have been told don't still need to be told. They do. There's still a need for that communication to come out. I just think that the process is moving into a new era. And I'd like to explore that. It would be, I think, an interesting conversation on how that is affecting poetry and literature at large. So that's just one aspect. So there's other categories that are out there that I think have changed over time. I mentioned the dominant culture. You can call it European culture. You can call it white culture. However you want to define it, it's fine with me. Had modernism. Went through their own existential crisis, which was postmodernism. And now they've moved beyond that and they're redefining themselves as a part of an overall community, not as the dominant culture, but as part of an overall community. And I think that has been, it's not my term, been defined and is being categorized as meta-modern, which is an extremely important part of that cultural growth. I think if you were to categorize my poetry, it'd be meta-modern, but I think that's obvious why. But that's not what I will review some meta-modernist books, but not my own. This is a burfer by reader, for readers. Insta poetry, I think, is a fascinating category of poetry. It's really growing, and I look forward to reviewing that. Now we have to go online for a lot of that poetry because it is Instagram poetry. But many of those poets are being published, and I am thrilled to be in the infant stages of this. Some remarkable poetry being written in this short form, and I do love the short form. That I am thrilled to be on the beginning aspects of this. I will not be around long enough to live to see it come to, I think, its greatest moments, but to be here when it begins and the authors that are defining this, if I can use that term now that I've butchered it, and creating this type of poetry. It's a great thrill for me to be here at this time to watch this. Another category of poetry that I would really like to review and be in conversation with many of you booktubers is a type of poetry I'm going to call poetry, after Edgar Allan Poe, who started this whole category for me anyway, in writing The Raven and some of these other poems. It's really in the horror category. I think this is an extremely underrepresented, extremely underrated form of poetry. We have fantastic poets out there writing in genres like horror, like fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien and others that write fantasy poetry and science fiction poetry that I find fantastic. I think they're so underrated, so underrepresented that I would like to have a few reviews, and as often as I can, I will review some of these genre poets, but I'm going to call them poetry poets after Edgar Allan Poe because it's my channel. I can call it what I want. So these are the kinds of things. There are other categories that I'm going to delve into, that I'm going to define. How I got to those categories, you'll see if you watch the video, the 5,000 years history of postmodern poetry, and I hope you'll join me there for that part of the conversation. And I hope that you'll join me in continuing this journey and this conversation about contemporary poetry, the postmodernist era of poetry. And if we peruse the past, pay attention to present poets, I think we will be able to prognosticate together about what the future will think of this era's worth of poetry. I look forward to joining you in that conversation. Goodbye, too.